You know, the first half of the 20th century in Britain was just pure chaos, a total revolution. An entire world of certainty was completely ripped apart, and English literature didn't just sit back and record this change, it actually helped drive it. So we're going to dive into how this profound rupture happened and what it all meant for society.
And this quote, man, it just nails the central paradox of the whole era. On the one hand, humanity was mastering the physical world with incredible things like steam engines and airplanes. But at the exact same time, it was going through what the writer A.C. Ward called a moral and spiritual relapse. So you've got this story of a society just rocketing forward and at the same time stumbling backward.
Okay, to really get a handle on the explosion that was the 20th century, we've got to first look at what was being blown up, right? And that was the super stable Victorian world. I want you to think of the 19th century not just as a time period, but as a total mindset. They saw their society like a house, built on these unshakable foundations, something they truly believed was set in stone for all time.
So what were those unshakable foundations? Well, for the Victorians, everything rested on four main pillars: the home, the Constitution, the Empire, and the Christian religion. Now, these weren't just seen as institutions. They were seen as final revelations, things you just didn't question or tinker with. They simply were. And that gave life this incredibly powerful sense of order, of permanence.
And this whole belief system, this idea of permanence, it was all held up by what was called the voice of authority. The Victorian instinct wasn't to challenge or to pick things apart, but to accept. It was a culture built on affirming what the experts said, whether that expert was a priest, a politician, or a poet. Yeah, the default setting was just believe. Don't question.
But then, bam, the 20th century crashes in, and a completely new way of thinking starts to take hold, building up into this full-blown modern revolt. We're not talking about a quiet little shift here. This was what you'd call an interrogative habit of mind, a mindset that was about to challenge every single thing the Victorians held sacred.
Oh man, this quote from the playwright George Bernard Shaw it crackles with the frustration of this new modern age. His character, Andrew Undershaft, is basically screaming from the rooftops, hey, why are we upgrading our technology but clinging to these ancient, dusty social ideas? It's just a brilliant way to show that growing impatience with the old Victorian ways.
But here's the thing. Writers like Shaw weren't just sitting around complaining. No, they were offering a new creed, a new way forward. Instead of just blindly accepting that voice of authority, their message was super simple but totally revolutionary. Question, examine, test. It was a call to replace blind acceptance with your own personal conviction.
Now, for a society that was literally raised on absolute certainty, this was, well, it was terrifying. This line from another of Shaw's plays just captures that dizzying feeling perfectly. The solid ground of Victorian values was suddenly turning into quicksand right under their feet. Can you imagine how disorienting that must have felt?
So all this chaos in society, it just rips the literary world in two. Writers were suddenly forced to ask this really fundamental question. In a world where all the old rules are just breaking apart, what is art even for anymore? And two completely different, competing visions for art emerged.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the Fabians, guys like H.G. Wells and Shaw. They believed in art for life's sake, the idea that literature should be a tool, something to create social and political change written for the whole community. And then, on the other side, you have the Modernists from the Bloomsbury Group. Think Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot. They were all about art for art's sake, focusing on the super complex inner life of the individual, and they often just retreated from all that messy political stuff.
And then we get to 1922. This year is a huge turning point. When James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland drop, high literature deliberately takes a step away from the everyday reader. I mean, these works were complex, they were difficult, and they were completely unapologetic about being intellectual. It was like a conscious retreat from the main highway of communication into what was called an esoteric fastness, which is basically a fancy way of saying a remote fortress just for intellectuals, totally inaccessible to the average person.
Okay, so while the intellectual elite are off building their fortress, something massive is happening out in broader society, and it's getting supercharged by the world wars. The focus is shifting, moving away from the individual and towards the collective, and this gives rise to what's known as the mass man.
And you can see the stark difference right here. See, early in the century, you had writers like H.G. Wells who celebrated the common man, that quirky, independent little guy, like his characters Mr. Polly or Art Kipps. But by the middle of the century, he's been replaced by the mass man, just an anonymous unit, a number to be managed by the state. Basically, like a punched card in a giant machine.
And this didn't just happen by accident. A whole bunch of forces were pushing this change. Everything from the repetitive work on the assembly line to the giant bureaucratic machine of the welfare state. Individual skill, that sense of craftsmanship, it just started to vanish, replaced by this mass-produced uniformity.
And even the world of commerce adapted to this new reality. Check this out. It's a memo from the National Union of Teachers, and they are sounding the alarm about mass advertising. The goal wasn't to persuade an individual with facts anymore. Oh no. It was to trigger an automatic emotional response in the crowd, totally bypassing reason to get right at the subconscious desires of the masses.
So where does all this leave us? What's the legacy of this massive rebellion? Well, that early 20th century decision to just scrap all certainty had these really long-term and probably unforeseen consequences. The intellectual revolt against Victorian rules, it didn't just stay in the pages of books. It would bubble up in society decades later. Fast forward to the 1950s, and a whole new generation of rebels shows up on the scene, the beatniks. They basically took the early modernist disgust with society and pushed it to its absolute logical extreme. They didn't just want to question society, they wanted to completely contract out of it, rejecting its values, its jobs, its conventions, all of it.
But here's a fascinating twist, and it comes from the ultimate rebel himself, George Bernard Shaw. He once argued that without good manners, human society is intolerable and impossible. And that just forces us to ask a really tough question, doesn't it? Were those old Victorian rules just stuffy, outdated traditions? Or were they the very things that made society livable? By tearing down the entire structure, did they lose something essential in the process?
And really, that is the fundamental question of this whole modern rupture. The 20th century traded the, let's face it, suffocating certainty of the Victorians for a chaotic but really dynamic world of questions. It unleashed this incredible intellectual and artistic energy, for sure, but it also helped create a kind of spiritual vacuum and a society of alienated masses. So when you tally it all up, in scrapping all that certainty, what was gained and what was truly lost?